No school, no childhood, just survival. That was the only truth Thomas Whitfield ever knew. At 7 years old, while the sons of wealthy merchants dreamed beneath quilted blankets in their warm brick homes, Thomas was already stumbling through the frozen, filthy streets of Manchester, his bare feet cracking against the icy cobblestones, his breath hanging in the air like smoke from the very factories that had swallowed his childhood whole. Every single morning, every single day, without exception, without mercy. 1842, no school or childhood, life during the toughest Industrial Revolution years. This is not a page from a dusty textbook. This is the story of a boy who never got the chance to be a boy whose hands bled so that machines could keep spinning, a boy who should have been learning to read, to play, to laugh, but instead learned only how to endure. Thomas lived in Ancoats, a district in the eastern heart of Manchester that had become one of the most wretched slums in all of England. The streets were unpaved, lined with open sewers that overflowed with waste. The houses were crammed together so tightly that sunlight never reached the ground floors. Friedrich Engels, the German philosopher who lived in Manchester during this very period, described these neighborhoods in devastating detail in his book The Condition of the Working Class in England, published in 1845. He wrote about streets filled with filth, about dwellings so degraded that no family could live in them with any dignity, about a working class that had been reduced to conditions barely fit for human survival. Thomas lived inside those pages. He breathed that air. He drank that water. He was one of the thousands of invisible children that Engels observed and the world ignored. Thomas's father, George Whitfield, had once been a handloom weaver in the green countryside of Lancashire. He had been a proud man, a man who understood the rhythm of honest labor, the shuttle moving back and forth, the cloth growing inch by inch beneath his hands. But the machines had come. The power looms were faster, cheaper, and merciless. The cottage industry that had sustained families for generations was crushed in less than a decade. As historian E.P. Thompson documented in his landmark work, The Making of the English Working Class, published in 1966, the Industrial Revolution did not merely change how people worked. It dismantled entire ways of life. It shattered communities. It turned fathers into strangers and children into commodities. George had moved his family to Manchester chasing factory wages that promised a better life. What he found instead was a city choking on its own smoke, where the rivers ran black and the air tasted of sulfur, where the only thing cheaper than cotton was a child's labor. Thomas's mother, Mary, had died 2 years earlier, giving birth to his younger sister, Agnes. The birth had been complicated. There was no doctor. Doctors cost money the Whitfields did not have. Mary bled through the night while George held her hand and prayed. By morning she was gone. George never recovered. The grief hollowed him out from the inside, and the gin filled the empty space. Within months, he had gone from a broken-hearted husband to a man who could barely stand by midday. He still worked at the mill when he was sober enough, but the wages he earned disappeared into the public houses that lined every corner of Ancoats. Thomas had an older brother too, William, who was 9. But William worked in a different mill across town, and the two boys rarely saw each other except on Sundays, when the factories were closed and the streets filled with exhausted families trying to remember what rest felt like. So Thomas became the provider at 7 years old. The mill owner, a man named Mr. Hargraves, paid Thomas 3 shillings a week for 14 hours of labor a day. 3 shillings. Barely enough to buy bread for the week. Thomas's job was to work as a scavenger, one of the most dangerous roles in the cotton mill. Scavengers were always children, because only children were small enough to crawl beneath the massive spinning machines while they were still running to collect loose cotton threads and waste from the floor. One wrong movement, 1 second of hesitation, and the machine would catch a finger, a hand, an arm. The Children's Employment Commission of 1842, a Royal Commission report that would eventually shake Victorian England to its very foundations, documented these conditions in horrifying detail. According to the Commission, children made up over 25% of the entire mining and factory workforce in England. In some textile mills, children between the ages of 9 and 18 constituted more than half of all workers. Clark Nardinelli, in his study Child Labor and the Industrial Revolution, published in 1990, confirmed that employers actively preferred children because they were cheaper, easier to control, and physically suited to tasks that adult bodies could not perform. Every morning Thomas rose in the dark, splashed cold water on his face from a bucket that smelled of iron, kissed Agnes on the forehead while she slept, and walked 20 minutes through the streets to the mill. The factory bell rang at 5:30. By 6 o'clock the machines were running and Thomas was on his hands and knees beneath the looms, gathering threads, dodging the mechanical arms that swung inches above his head. The air inside the mill was thick with cotton dust, so thick that Dr. Michael Ward, testifying before a parliamentary committee in 1819, had described how he could not remain inside a cotton factory for 10 minutes without gasping for breath. He had wondered aloud how workers could possibly endure 12 or 15 hours in such conditions. The answer, of course, was that many of them could not. They developed lung diseases, they coughed blood, they died young, and the youngest among them, children like Thomas, were the most vulnerable of all. Thomas rarely spoke during work. Speaking wasted energy, and energy was something he could not afford to lose. He had learned to move quickly, to keep his head down, to avoid the overseer's gaze. The overseer was a broad-shouldered man named Mr. Grimshaw, who carried a wooden switch and used it freely on any child who slowed the production line. Thomas had felt that switch across his back more times than he could count. He never cried, not because he was brave, but because he had learned that crying changed nothing. Tears did not fill Agnes's stomach. Tears did not bring his mother back. Tears did not make his father sober. So Thomas swallowed them, the way he swallowed the cotton dust, and kept moving. Every evening Thomas walked home in the fading light, his body aching, his fingers cracked and bleeding, his lungs burning. He always saved a piece of his midday bread, a thin slice that he was given at noon along with a cup of water that tasted of rust, and brought it home for Agnes. She would be waiting by the door, her eyes wide, her small body trembling from the cold. Thomas would kneel down, unwrap the bread, break it in half, and give her the bigger piece. He always gave her the bigger piece. He never ate first. He never complained. The Bible says in Psalm 82:3, "Defend the weak and the fatherless, uphold the cause of the poor and the oppressed." No one was defending Thomas. No one in Manchester, in all of England, was looking at this boy and seeing what should have been obvious, that he was a child, not a machine. That his hands were made for holding books, not bleeding beneath looms. That his lungs were made for laughter, not for drowning in cotton dust. But Thomas defended Agnes. In his own small, quiet, desperate way, he did what the adults around him had failed to do. He protected someone weaker than himself, and in doing so he kept alive a flicker of something that the factories were designed to extinguish: his humanity. Sometimes in those rare quiet moments before sleep took him, Thomas would close his eyes and try to remember his mother's face. He could still hear her voice, soft, warm, singing a lullaby that he could no longer recall the words to. He remembered the smell of her hair, the feeling of her hand on his forehead when he was ill. Those memories were fading, growing thinner each day, like the cotton threads he pulled from beneath the machines. And Thomas knew with a certainty that no 7-year-old should ever possess, that if he did not hold on to those memories, if he let the factory grind them away, then he would become exactly what Mr. Hargraves and Mr. Grimshaw wanted him to be: a pair of hands. Nothing more, nothing less, just another small body feeding the machines of progress. He refused. Quietly, stubbornly, without knowing why, Thomas refused. Confira se já é inscrito neste canal, porque aqui nós contamos as histórias que foram enterradas pelo tempo, as vozes que ninguém quis ouvir. Se você acredita que essas histórias merecem ser contadas, inscreva-se agora e faça parte dessa missão. The day Mr. Slade arrived at the mill, something in the air changed. The children felt it before they understood it, a tightening in the chest, a quickening of the pulse, the instinct of small creatures sensing a predator. The previous overseer, Mr. Grimshaw, had been cruel in the way that indifference is cruel. He struck children when they slowed down, but he took no pleasure in it. It was mechanical, routine, like the machines themselves. Slade was different. Slade watched. He studied the children the way a hawk studies the ground below. He noticed which ones flinched, which ones cried, which ones could be broken quickly and which ones would resist, and he enjoyed the process of breaking them. Friedrich Engels described men like Slade with chilling precision. In The Condition of the Working Class in England, he documented a system in which overseers held absolute power over child workers, using threats, fines, physical punishment, and instant dismissal as tools of control. According to a parliamentary survey conducted in 1833, an astonishing 95% of all disciplinary actions used against child laborers were negative: beatings, wage deductions, termination. Only 4% involved any kind of reward. Only 1% involved a promotion or a raise. The children existed in a world designed entirely around fear, and Slade was fear made flesh. Slade noticed Thomas on the first day. Perhaps it was the boy's silence that caught his attention. Most children whimpered or flinched when Slade passed. Thomas did neither. He kept his eyes on his work, his small hands moving with practiced speed, his jaw set, his expression blank. This was not defiance in the traditional sense. Thomas was not trying to challenge anyone. He had simply learned through 2 years of factory labor that showing emotion was dangerous. Emotion attracted attention. Attention attracted pain. So he had built a wall around himself, brick by invisible brick, and he hid behind it. But Slade saw the wall, and he wanted to tear it down. The first time Slade struck Thomas was on a Tuesday afternoon. Thomas had coughed, a deep rattling cough that came from the cotton dust that had been building in his lungs for months. Slade was behind him instantly. The leather strap came down across Thomas's shoulders with a crack that echoed through the factory floor. "Coughing costs time, boy," Slade said, his voice flat and cold. "Time costs cotton. Cotton costs money, and you are not worth the money I lose when you cough." Thomas did not cry. He did not flinch. He simply absorbed the blow, the way the floor absorbed the cotton waste, and returned to his work. This enraged Slade more than any scream could have. He struck Thomas again and again, 3 blows in total. Thomas's back burned like fire, but his face showed nothing. He gave Slade nothing, and from that moment the overseer made Thomas his personal project. Over the following weeks, Slade systematically targeted Thomas with a cruelty that went beyond discipline into something darker. He added 2 extra hours to Thomas's shifts. He docked his wages for invented infractions. A thread missed, a step too slow, a glance in the wrong direction. He made Thomas clean the privies after his shift, while the other children were allowed to leave. He mocked him in front of the younger workers, calling him the mute and the little stone. The other children watched in silence, terrified that if they showed sympathy, they would be next. Thomas endured it all. Not because he was unbreakable. He was a 7-year-old child, and every blow left a mark on his body and his soul, but because he had made a silent promise to himself. He would not give Slade the satisfaction. He would not give any of them the satisfaction. The historian Carolyn Tuttle, in her detailed study Hard at Work in Factories and Mines, published in 1999, documented how factory overseers used systematic psychological and physical abuse to maintain control over child workers. Slade was not an aberration. He was the system working exactly as it was designed to work, but the system had a crack, and the crack appeared on a Sunday. Thomas was walking along the River Irwell, as he sometimes did on his one free day, letting the sound of the water drown out the phantom noise of the machines that haunted his ears, even in silence. The river was filthy, brown, slow-moving, lined with refuse, but it was open, and the sky above it was wide, and for a few hours Thomas could pretend he was somewhere else, somewhere green, somewhere his mother might have taken him once, before everything changed. He was walking past the bridge near Angel Meadow when he saw it, a torn page from a book lying in the mud, half soaked by the rain. Thomas picked it up. He could not read. No one had ever taught him. He had never held a book, never sat in a classroom, never heard a teacher speak his name, but he recognized the shapes of the letters. He had seen them on signs, on crates, on the labels of the cotton bales. He sat beneath the bridge, sheltered from the rain, and traced the words with his blackened fingers, sounding out the letters the way a blind man traces the contours of a face, trying to see through touch what his eyes could not give him. That was when Eleanor found him. Miss Eleanor Graves was a Sunday school teacher. one of a small but growing number of reformers who believed that every child, no matter how poor, no matter how broken, deserved to learn. She had been walking to her small schoolroom in a rented basement near Oldham Road when she saw the boy sitting under the bridge, bent over a scrap of paper with an intensity that stopped her in her tracks. She knelt beside him, the mud soaked into her dress. She did not care. She looked at the page in his hands, then at his face, the hollowed cheeks, the dark circles under his eyes, the raw, cracked fingers. And she asked a question that no adult had asked Thomas in over 2 years. "What is your name?" Thomas looked at her. He did not answer immediately. He had learned to distrust adults. Every adult in his life had either hurt him, abandoned him, or ignored him. But there was something in Eleanor's voice, in her eyes, that was different. There was no pity, no condescension, just genuine, quiet interest. "Thomas," he said. His voice was small and hoarse from disuse. Eleanor smiled. "Would you like to learn to read that page, Thomas?" He nodded. Eleanor began teaching Thomas every Sunday. Her classroom was a damp basement that smelled of mildew with a cracked slate board and a handful of donated books so worn that the pages were falling out. But to Thomas, it was a cathedral. Eleanor taught him the alphabet first, then simple words, then sentences. She taught him to write his own name. The first time he had ever seen it rendered in letters, solid and real, proof that he existed as something more than a pair of hands. Charles Dickens had published Oliver Twist 5 years earlier in 1837, and the novel's unflinching portrayal of starving orphans exploited by a heartless system had begun to stir the conscience of the nation. Eleanor had read it. She had wept over it. And she had decided that weeping was not enough. She would act. As the book of Proverbs instructs in chapter 22, verse 6, "Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it." Eleanor believed this with every fibre of her being. She believed that the spark of intelligence she saw in Thomas's eyes could become a flame, if only someone would shield it from the wind. Thomas learned quickly, faster than any child Eleanor had ever taught. Within weeks he could read simple sentences. Within 2 months he was reading passages from the donated books, stories about faraway places, about animals, about children who went to school every day and had parents who came home sober and alive. Those stories were almost painful to read because they showed Thomas a world he had never known existed, a world where children played, where they laughed without fear, where they were held and loved and told that they mattered. Thomas would read those passages over and over, sitting alone in the empty classroom after the other children had gone, and something would twist inside his chest, not quite sadness, not quite anger, but something deeper, something that had no name. It was the feeling of understanding for the first time that what had been taken from him was real. That childhood was not just an idea, it was something other children actually had, and he had been robbed of it. Slade found out about the Sunday lessons. One of the other children had mentioned it, not out of malice but out of innocent conversation, and Slade had been listening. He confronted Thomas before the Monday shift, grabbing him by the collar and slamming him against the brick wall of the mill entrance. "I hear you've been playing at school, boy," Slade said, his voice barely above a whisper, which was somehow worse than shouting. "Books don't spin cotton. Letters don't fill orders. You are a machine, Whitfield. A small, cheap, replaceable machine, and machines don't need to read." He struck Thomas across the face with the back of his hand. Thomas's lips split open. Blood ran down his chin. The other children filing into the mill turned their faces away. No one stopped, no one spoke. Slade added 3 extra hours to Thomas's shift and docked an entire day's wages. That night, Thomas limped home to Agnes with a swollen eye and blood dried on his collar. Agnes began to cry the moment she saw him. Thomas knelt down, took her small hands in his, and said something that would stay with her for the rest of her life. "Don't cry, Aggie. I learned a new word today. Hope. Miss Graves says it means something good is coming, even when everything around you says it isn't. I believe her." Se essa história está tocando o seu coração neste momento, pare e deixe um comentário. Escreva: "Toda criança merece uma infância. Eu preciso saber se você está sentindo o que Thomas sentiu. Esse comentário é pela memória de todas as crianças que nunca tiveram voz. The summer of 1842 arrived in Manchester like a fever. The air was thick with heat and smoke and something else. A restlessness that could be felt in the streets, in the factories, in the crowded public houses where men gathered after their shifts to drink and talk in low, urgent voices. England was in crisis. The economy had been in recession for years. Wages had been cut repeatedly. Food prices had soared. Families that had already been living on the edge of starvation were now falling over it. In August, a wave of strikes would sweep through the industrial north, the plug plot riots, as they came to be known, when desperate workers pulled the plugs from factory boilers to force the mills to shut down. It was a time of fury and fear, of a working class pushed to its absolute limit. But before the riots, before the fury, there came a report, and it changed everything. The Children's Employment Commission had been established by Parliament to investigate the working conditions of children in mines and factories across the United Kingdom. Its investigators were sent into the depths of coal mines and the bowels of textile mills to document what they found. What they found was a horror that the comfortable classes of Victorian England had never imagined, or had chosen not to imagine. In the coal mines, children as young as 5 years old worked as trappers, sitting alone in complete darkness, for 12 hours at a stretch, opening and closing ventilation doors to keep the air flowing through the tunnels. Children of 6 and 7 were employed as hurriers, dragging heavy carts of coal through tunnels so narrow that they had to crawl on their hands and knees, sometimes through water that reached their waists. The tunnels were sometimes only 16 inches high. The Children's Employment Commission of 1842, published as The Condition and Treatment of the Children Employed in the Mines and Collieries of the United Kingdom by William Strange in London, included testimony after testimony from these children. One boy, James Pierce, aged 12, told the commissioners that he had been working in the pits since he was 4.5 years old, sitting alone in the dark for 12 hours a day, earning 6pence. He took the money home to his mother, every penny. Another child, documented by the commission as Nicol Hudson, was described as permanently lame because his broken leg had been set incorrectly. The report noted simply that the pit made him sick. These were not exceptions, they were the norm. Carolyn Tuttle, in Hard at Work in Factories and Mines, published in 1999, calculated that by 1842, 1/3 of the underground workforce in British coal mines was under the age of 18. In some regions, children and young people made up 40% of all mine workers. The Commission's report, illustrated with engravings showing children crawling through tunnels and chained to coal carts, was published and distributed to Parliament. Victorian society was horrified. The comfortable middle classes, who had been content to buy cheap coal without asking where it came from, were suddenly confronted with images of 5-year-olds working in conditions that would have shocked a medieval dungeon keeper. Eleanor Graves obtained a copy of the report through her network of reformers and educators. She read it in a single night by candlelight, and when she finished, she sat in silence for a long time, staring at the wall. She had known, of course, that conditions were terrible. She saw the evidence every Sunday in the faces of the children who came to her classroom, the hollow eyes, the stunted bodies, the coughs that never went away. But the Commission report laid it out in such systematic, undeniable detail that it was impossible to look away. She brought the report to a meeting of reformers held in a church hall near Piccadilly. She read passages aloud. Some of the listeners wept. Others sat in stony silence. One man, a factory owner who had come out of curiosity, stood up and left without a word. His own mills employed children. The Mines and Collieries Act was passed by Parliament that same year in 1842. It prohibited all girls and all boys under the age of 10 from working underground in coal mines. It was the first piece of legislation in British history that directly acknowledged that children were being destroyed by industrial labour and that the government had a responsibility to intervene. Isaiah 10:1-2 warns with terrible clarity, "Woe to those who make unjust laws, to those who issue oppressive decrees, to deprive the needy of justice and rob the poor of my people of their right, that widows may be their spoil, and that they may make the fatherless their prey." The lawmakers of 1842 had finally heard that warning. But the Act did not cover the textile mills. It did not cover the cotton factories of Manchester. It did not cover Thomas. Eleanor told Thomas about the Mines Act on a quiet Sunday afternoon. She explained that children would no longer have to work underground in the coal mines. Thomas listened carefully, the way he always listened, with his whole body still, his eyes focused, absorbing every word. When Eleanor finished, there was a long silence. Then Thomas said something that Eleanor would remember for the rest of her life. "What about us, Miss Graves? What about the mills?" Eleanor opened her mouth to answer, then closed it. She had no answer. The mills were not covered. The cotton factories would continue to operate exactly as they had. Children like Thomas would continue to crawl beneath the spinning machines, breathe the cotton dust, endure the strap, and work 14-hour days for 3 shillings a week. The law had cracked open a door, but it had not opened it wide enough for Thomas to walk through. On his way home, Thomas passed a small park where children from the merchant class were playing. They were clean, well-fed, dressed in clothes without holes. A boy about Thomas's age was flying a kite, laughing as it caught the wind. A girl was chasing a hoop with a stick, her mother watching from a bench with a smile. Thomas stopped and watched them. He did not feel envy exactly. He felt something more complex, a strange, aching awareness that these children inhabited the same city, breathed the same air, lived under the same sky, and yet existed in an entirely different universe. Their childhood was real. It was happening right in front of him, and it looked nothing like his own. The book of Proverbs, chapter 14, verse 31 says, "Whoever oppresses a poor man insults his maker, but he who is generous to the needy honors him." Thomas did not know this verse. He could not yet read the Bible, but he felt its truth in his bones. He understood, standing at the edge of that park, watching those children play, that something was profoundly wrong with a world that gave everything to some and nothing to others. That understanding was not anger, not yet. It was something quieter and more dangerous. It was clarity. That evening, Thomas did something he had never done before. He sat down with Agnes in their cold, dark room, took a piece of chalk that Eleanor had given him, and began writing letters on the stone floor. He wrote A, then B, then C. Agnes watched with wide eyes, fascinated. "What's that?" she asked, pointing at the letter A. "That's your name," Thomas said. "That's how it starts." "Hi for Agnes." He wrote her full name on the floor, letter by letter, sounding each one out the way Eleanor had taught him. Agnes stared at it as if it were the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. "That's me," she whispered. Thomas nodded. "That's you, and nobody can take it away." He began teaching her. Right there on the floor, in the dark, with a piece of stolen chalk and the last light of a dying candle. He taught his 5-year-old sister the alphabet the way Eleanor had taught him, with patience, with care, with the stubborn belief that knowledge was something no factory owner, no overseer, no system of exploitation could ever steal. Scene. George Whitfield stumbles through the door. He is less drunk than usual. He sees the letters on the floor. He stops. George came home that night less drunk than usual. He pushed open the door, expecting to find what he always found. Agnes asleep, Thomas lying still on the straw mattress, the room cold and silent. Instead, he found his 2 children sitting on the floor together, surrounded by chalk letters, Thomas pointing at each one while Agnes repeated the sounds. George stood in the doorway, swaying slightly, and something moved behind his eyes. Something that the djinn had been trying to drown for 2 years. He did not speak. He did not come closer. He simply stood there, watching his son do what he himself had been unable to do, keep the family alive. Not just their bodies, their minds, their spirits. George leaned against the doorframe and pressed his hand over his mouth, and for the first time since Mary's death he wept, silently in the shadows where his children could not see. But Thomas heard him. Thomas always heard everything. The following Sunday, George did something unexpected. He walked Thomas to Eleanor's classroom. He did not go inside. He was ashamed of his appearance, of his smell, of what he had become. But he stood outside the window and watched as Thomas read aloud from a book, his small voice filling the basement room with words that George himself had never learned to read. Eleanor noticed George standing there. She met his eyes through the glass. She did not judge him. She simply nodded, the way one human being acknowledges another's pain without needing to name it. George nodded back. It was not redemption. It was not recovery. But it was a step, a single fragile step away from the edge. Tiago 5:4 declares, "The wages you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty." The cries of children like Thomas were reaching more than heaven. They were reaching the ears of a nation, slowly, painfully, imperfectly. But they were being heard. The autumn of 1842 came to Manchester wrapped in smoke and silence. The plug plot riots of August had been suppressed. Soldiers had marched through the streets. Workers had been arrested, beaten, imprisoned. The factories had reopened, and the machines had resumed their relentless grinding. But something had shifted beneath the surface of English society, a crack in the foundation that no amount of force could repair. The Commission report had done its work. The testimonies of children, their voices, their words, their pain recorded in ink on government paper, had penetrated the conscience of the nation. It would take years, decades, for the full weight of reform to arrive. The Factory Act of 1844 would limit children aged 9 to 13 to 6.5 hours of work per day and require them to attend school. The 10 Hours Act of 1847 would cap the working day at 10 hours for women and young people in textile mills. These laws were imperfect. They were slow. They were frequently ignored and poorly enforced. But they represented something that had not existed before. The recognition, written into the law of the land, that children were not machines, that they had rights, that their suffering mattered. Something changed at the mill as well. Mr. Hargraves, the owner, had read the Commission report. He had attended a meeting at the Manchester Chamber of Commerce where the findings were discussed. He had seen the engravings. Children chained to coal carts, children crawling through tunnels, children with broken bones and ruined lungs. Perhaps it was conscience. Perhaps it was the fear of future legislation. Perhaps it was both. Whatever the reason, Slade was dismissed. A new overseer arrived, a younger man named Mr. Cartwright, who had been a school teacher before the recession had cost him his position. Cartwright did not carry a strap. He did not strike the children. He spoke to them in a firm but measured tone, and when he corrected them, he explained why. It was not kindness in the fullest sense. The hours were still long, the work was still dangerous, the wages were still pitiful, but it was the absence of cruelty, and for children who had known nothing else, the absence of cruelty felt like grace. Thomas noticed the change immediately. His body, which had been coiled tight as a spring for months, began slowly to unclench. He still worked 14 hours a day. He still crawled beneath the machines. He still breathed the cotton dust. But the fear was gone. The constant, grinding fear that had been his companion since Slade's arrival had lifted, and in its place was something unfamiliar. Space. Space to think. Space to breathe. Space to remember that he was not just a pair of hands. By the time Thomas turned 8, he could read and write fluently. Eleanor had introduced him to the Bible, to the works of John Bunyan, to the hymns of Charles Wesley. She had also introduced him to a group of visiting reformers from London, members of the growing movement for education reform, who believed that universal schooling was not a luxury but a necessity, not a privilege for the wealthy but a right for all. Thomas stood before these men and women in Eleanor's basement classroom and read aloud from the book of Isaiah, chapter 1, verse 17. "Learn to do good, seek justice, defend the oppressed, take up the cause of the fatherless." His voice was clear and steady, and the room was absolutely silent. One of the reformers, a woman named Mrs. Elizabeth Fry, wiped her eyes with a handkerchief. Another, a man who had spent 20 years lobbying Parliament for factory reform, leaned forward in his chair and said quietly to Eleanor, This boy is the reason we do this." Thomas Whitfield never became rich. He never left Manchester. He never attended a proper school with desks and uniforms and playing fields, but he became something more important than wealthy. He became necessary. By the time he was 12, Thomas was teaching at Eleanor's Sunday school. He stood at the front of the room, chalk in hand, and looked into the faces of children who were living the same life he had lived. Children with raw hands and aching backs and lungs full of cotton dust. Children who had never been told that they mattered, that their minds were worth cultivating, that the letters on a page could unlock doors that no factory owner could close. Thomas taught them to read. He taught them to write their names. He taught them that they were more than machines. William, Thomas's older brother, had found work as a clerk's apprentice after learning to read at a different Sunday school across the city. He was the first Whitfield in recorded memory to hold a position that did not require manual labor. George had died in the spring of 1848, his body finally giving out after years of gin and factory dust and grief. He died in the same room where Thomas had written Agnes's name on the floor in chalk. But before he died, on a cold February evening, George had reached for Thomas's hand and said something that Thomas would carry with him forever. "I'm proud of you, son. You did what I couldn't do. You kept us human." Thomas held his father's hand until it went cold. He did not cry, but this time the reason was different. He did not cry because he understood that his father's words were not just an expression of pride, they were a confession, an acknowledgement that George had failed, and a recognition that Thomas had found a way to succeed, not despite the failure, but through it. Agnes became a teacher. She had learned her letters on a cold stone floor by candlelight, taught by a brother who was barely more than a child himself, and she had never stopped learning. By the time she was 18, she was running her own classroom in a school built by the reformers who had visited Eleanor's basement years before. On the wall behind her desk, framed in simple wood, was a piece of slate with a single letter on it, the letter A, written in Thomas's handwriting on the night he first taught her. She kept it there to remind herself and her students where it all began. Not in a grand institution, not in a wealthy home, but on a cold floor, in the dark, with a stolen piece of chalk and a brother who refused to let the world tell him, or his sister, that they were nothing. 1842 was one of the darkest years in England's history, a year when childhood was a luxury that only the wealthy could afford. When children as young as 4 were sent into factories and mines to feed the machines of an empire that measured progress in cotton bales and coal tonnage and profit margins, never in the laughter of its youngest citizens. The Bible in Psalm 127 verse 3 says, "Children are a heritage from the Lord, the fruit of the womb a reward." But in 1842, children were not treated as a heritage or a reward. They were treated as raw material, fuel for an engine that did not care whether they lived or died, so long as the wheels kept turning. And yet, even in the darkest year, there were those who refused to accept this. Eleanor Graves, who knelt in the mud beside a boy with a torn page and asked his name. Thomas Whitfield, who taught his sister the alphabet on a stone floor by candlelight. George Whitfield, who wept in the shadows and finally found the courage to walk his son to school. The reformers who read the commission report and said, "Enough." The lawmakers who wrote the first imperfect, insufficient, desperately necessary laws to protect the children that a nation had chosen to forget. Psalm 146 verse 7 says, "The Lord executes justice for the oppressed and gives food to the hungry. The Lord sets the prisoners free." Thomas's prison had no bars. It had spinning machines and leather straps and 14-hour days and cotton dust that filled his lungs like slow poison. But he found freedom anyway. He found it in letters, in words, in the stubborn, quiet, unbreakable refusal to let the world define him as less than human. And that, in the end, is the most powerful revolution of all. Not the revolution that built the machines, not the revolution that created the factories, but the revolution that happens inside a single human heart when it decides, against all evidence, against all reason, against all the cruelty and indifference that the world can throw at it, that it will not be broken. Thomas Whitfield was not a hero in the way that history books define heroes. He did not lead an army. He did not change a law. He did not write a book that shook the world. He was a boy who learned to read when reading was forbidden. A boy who taught his sister when teaching was impossible. A boy who kept his humanity alive in a world that was designed to destroy it. And in doing so, he proved something that every factory owner, every overseer, every system of exploitation in human history has tried to deny, that the human spirit, even in a child, especially in a child, is the one machine that can never be broken, not by leather straps, not by cotton dust, not by darkness, not by 14-hour days, not by poverty, not by grief, not by the toughest years of the toughest revolution the world had ever seen.